Wonderful to see you all tonight, and want to thank you for joining us for what I know was going to be an exciting program. My name is Sandy Treadway, and I'm the director here at the Library of Virginia, and I'm especially thrilled that you can be with us tonight and help us commemorate a very important project that we've been part of, and also to be part of our 200th anniversary year here at the library. So this is one of the programs we're doing in connection with that. Thank you. I can't take credit for that at all, but it's just a very special moment in our life and our history, and thank you for being here to share it with us. We're here tonight to commemorate Black History Month and to celebrate the completion of a signature project to document the lives and the contributions of Virginia's first African-American legislators. The library's Dictionary of Virginia Biography project joined with this effort in 2011 in collaboration with the Commonwealth's Martin Luther King Jr. Commission. And the goal was to research and write definitive histories of the 92 African-American men who served in the General Assembly from 1869 to 1890. Their stories, which very few Virginians were aware of at the time, as recently as 2011, are now a part of the collective digital story of our Commonwealth, thanks to the project's further collaboration with Virginia Humanities and Encyclopedia Virginia, which is a rich online resource that all of us have access to free 24/7. So this has been a decade-long effort, at least the library's involvement with it, and there have been some significant milestones along the way. So as part of this, in 2013, a commemorative plaque that identified all the early Black members of the House of Delegates, the Senate of Virginia, and the Constitutional Convention of 1867-68 was actually installed in the Capitol. And someone may speak a little bit about that tonight. That was not a given that would happen. In 2015, the library and the Martin Luther King Jr. Commission co-sponsored a symposium to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act that took place in 1965. And as part of that anniversary commemoration, descendants of Virginia's first Black legislators participated in a special program and a reception at the Capitol, and they had an opportunity to share their family histories and their stories with us. I understand that several of these descendants are also in the audience tonight. We actually had some places reserved for you up front, which you probably weren't aware of. But if you are one of those descendants, would you mind standing up or waving and letting folks know who you are? There we go. There you are. Thank you for being here tonight. That makes it extra special. So writing the stories of these extraordinary legislators, often the first and in some cases the only biography of these individuals, has been a true partnership between both houses of the General Assembly, the King Commission, the library, and Virginia Humanities, with each of those entities playing a really vital part. And it is the culmination of that collaborative journey that has brought us here tonight. We're delighted to have with us several really special folks who have been part of this project almost since its inception, and in one case, it was her idea for it. And it's just a delight that they are here, and I'm going to learn a lot from them because I realize that what I know about the project is just the tip of the iceberg. So with us this evening are, I'm going to do this alphabetically since that will be easier, so just raise your hand, although I think the audience knows you. We have the Honorable Viola Baskerville, who is active in Virginia's political life. I know you know her well. She's been on Richmond City Council, been a vice mayor, a former member of the House of Delegates, and also served as Secretary of Administration in former Governor Tim Kaine's administration. She is the inspiration behind and one of the founders of this Black Legislators Project. She's an avid genealogist and a charter member of the Greater Richmond chapter of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. So she knew from the beginning, not only was this doable with the right resources devoted to it, but it would be very, very important. Sitting to her right is Dr. Lauranett Lee, who is very familiar to us here. Lauranett is a public historian specializing in teaching, collaborating, and working with diverse community and academic audiences. She holds a doctoral degree in American history from the University of Virginia and has taught at numerous Virginia colleges, currently serving as an adjunct professor of liberal arts at the University of Richmond. She served on numerous city and state boards and commissions, and including the Dr. Martin Luther King Commission, and is the sole proprietor of LL Lee Associates, a consulting firm that works with museums, community and faith groups, and educational institutions across the Commonwealth. Sitting to Viola Baskerville's left is Ajena Rogers, who is not wearing her uniform tonight. I see her most often with her Smokey Bear hat on, but she is the supervisory park ranger at the National Park Service's Maggie L. Walker Historic Site. She is also a descendant of James A. Fields, an enslaved Virginian who became a prominent lawyer and is one of the state legislators that we are commemorating and honoring this evening. Before arriving in Richmond, she worked for the Park Service at the Blue Ridge Parkway, the Independence National Historical Park, and Valley Forge National Historical Park. And she, too, is a very avid and experienced researcher in African American history and genealogy. Sitting next to Ajena is Brent Tarter, who I have to describe as one of the most knowledgeable and prolific historians of Virginia that I know anywhere. Brent is a founder of the Dictionary of Virginia Biography Project, and since retiring from the library in 2010, he has published numerous works that have really not only expanded what we know about Virginia, but invited us to view our history in very new and different ways. I cannot list his bibliography tonight or we would never get to the program, but two of his most recent works, which I do encourage you to read, are Virginians and Their Histories, which was published in 2020, and he wrote with Mary Julienne and Barbara Batson, The Campaign for Women's Suffrage, that also came out that year. He and John Deal and Marianne Julienne of the library have just completed, and I'm sure you'll hear about it, the first draft of To Secure Justice for Ourselves, Black Virginians Claim Their Freedom, and that's expected to come out about 2024. And last, but definitely not least, is our moderator for this evening, Matthew Gibson, who's the Executive Director of Virginia Humanities. And Matthew really created and helped to endow Encyclopedia Virginia, which is an indispensable multimedia resource for all of us to use. It presents a really inclusive story of Virginian and is, again, available at your fingertips 24/7. Just remarkable resource. Matthew also serves on the Martin Luther King Memorial Commission and on Virginia's African American Cultural Resources Task Force. So you can tell we've got some really knowledgeable folks up here who really care about this project and have done much to bring it to fruition. And I'm going to turn the program over now to Matthew and sit down in the audience and just enjoy it. So it's all yours.
Thank you, Sandy, and welcome everyone. I'm very honored to be here with Viola, Lauranett, Ajena, and Brent this evening. And I'm just going to kick it off with a question. I think we all like origin stories, at least I do. And I want to turn to Viola and ask about the origin of this project, because I know it's an interesting story.
It's like giving birth and then finally seeing your child get a master's degree. It's been 25 years. This started in 1998. I had just been sworn in as a new legislator. I was walking through the halls of the Capitol, just kind of looking at the surroundings that I'd never worked in before, but had visited, and saw on the wall photographs of people. And so I stopped to look at the photographs, and they said across the top, Virginia legislators. I said, oh, this is interesting. Look at all these old white men. And then I looked more closely, and then I said, oh my gosh, there's some brothers down here. Who are these people? And I said, but they're mentioned nowhere else. I didn't even know about them. And I said, at some point, they're going to be lifted up. Their names are going to be lifted up. They deserve more than just being on pictures on a wall. And we have all these statues, and we have all these people at the Capitol that are recognized as well. I said, these are history makers. So around 2011, I was part of the King Commission's work plan for the emancipation. And an idea struck me that why don't I present a proposal before the commission to have these individuals' names put on plaques, their name, when they served, and the districts that represented. And so I presented the idea before the commission. It was chaired by Senator Marsh at the time, and then Delegate Jennifer McClellan, now Congresswoman-elect Jennifer McClellan. And they really loved the idea, but they said, yeah, but you're gonna have to do the research because we don't have staff to do it. So I came over to the Library of Virginia, started doing the research, read Dr. Luther Porter Jackson's book on Negro office holders in Virginia and other sources, and I just started compiling a list of names of individuals, and to the extent I could find short bios about them, I included the bios and presented it before the General Assembly, before the commission. The commission then wrote it as a piece of legislation in 2012. Delegate McClellan carried the bill, but there was resistance. They wanted to strike the resolution part that read that these names had to be on plaques. Those plaques would have been permanent, and they would have been at the Capitol. And so it was all right to acknowledge them, but not to put them on plaques. So this went back and forth. Delegate McQuinn fiercely defended the idea that they needed to be on plaques. And of course, some of the individuals that were vocal against it certainly didn't vote against it, but they made their feelings known. The bill passed 98-0 in the House and 40-0 in the Senate. And so in 2012, 2013, we had a celebration of the unveiling of the plaques. And then in 2015, I think there was the Emancipation Proclamation celebration. These plaques are supposed to be at the Capitol, at the old House, in the old House chambers. With this new administration, I don't know. I haven't been over there to check to see if they're still there. I hope they are, but good. I was getting worried. I think Virginia was the first, if not currently the only state that has the names of the Reconstruction era legislators in the state capitol. I may be incorrect about that, but I think definitely Virginia was the first. So that's how this project sort of came about, was that I really wanted these men and these history makers to be acknowledged.
Thank you. You know, you mentioned the plaques, and the resistance to sort of having things on plaques, on stone, if you will, because they can be easily erased if they're not on something that can be three-dimensional and maybe more permanent. That I think a lot about what happens when we don't learn history, or maybe a history is not available to us to be learned. For some of us, it allows us to live in a mythology pleasantly. For others, they're forced to live in a mythology unpleasantly. And for just thinking out loud, what are the things? Why is learning this history important?
Is that for me
For
or
everybody.
anybody?
For everybody, I think. And so if you want to. If somebody wants to just jump in, feel free, and then we can go from there. That might be dangerous. I don't know.
Well, hopefully, so we don't make the same mistakes again. But if we dampen down knowledge and we erase the truth, then people cannot make critical decisions about what it is that they need to know and able to just, move forward. So it's almost as if there is an attempt to keep people from learning the truth, knowing the truth, and be critical thinkers about how do we move forward.
Should we continue to hold on to a master narrative that is blatantly false? Should we remain an ignorant citizenry because certain people don't want to acknowledge the presence, the accomplishments, the humanity of a people? And I think that's what the African American legislators really pushed against, that they really wanted to be a part of society equally. And though they met resistance at every turn, they were determined that they would be treated equally. And they were unanimous about public education, which had been denied to people for so long. They were not unanimous about whether that education should be segregated or not. With the Freedmen schools, those were for African American children, but the statewide system that came about in 1870, that was a segregated system. And I think that is what has hobbled public education since then. And we can see that in our society now. Our public schools are nowhere near where they should be. When you look at the schools, the conditions of many of the schools, particularly in the city of Richmond, we have schools where the ceilings are crumbling. But yet in other parts of the city, in the counties, it's like those schools are in a totally different world. And when you look at who's in positions of power and who's being denied those positions of power or to have a voice in the administration of their schools, it tells you a lot about how important education is and the denial of education to people. So should we remain an ignorant society because we don't want to fund public education? That's a question we really have to ask ourselves when we look at the conditions of the schools now. And it's something I think the legislators, particularly the Black legislators, really wanted to push for, to have that equal education. I came across a poem by Langston Hughes, and we commemorate his birthday this month. And the poem, Let America Be America Again, the last verse says, "Oh, let my land be a land where liberty is crowned with no false patriotic wreath, but opportunity is real and life is free. Equality is in the air we breathe." And then there is a line that says, "America never was America to me. It never was America to me." Because African Americans had been denied education for so long, and to now have that opportunity, They seized it with everything they could. And I think that's what we have to seize back now.
But you know, it was also economic equity and opportunity. At that time, the Black labor movement was in full force in the United States. They had been meeting, the different labor organizations, they called them colored labor organizations, had been meeting statewide since the 1830s, and they met every year up until about 1864 or 1863, about that time. And so the political activism was also supported by the economic and activism, and also the labor activism. So there was this cauldron of activism that was going on outside of the Capitol and outside of the legislative body, as well as activism inside the legislative body. And also, the laborers knew that individuals had to be educated as well to be able to take part in the new economy that was coming out of the Civil War. So it was almost like a four-legged stool: education, political activity, economic activity, and labor activity.
Gina?
And to tie all of that together, your question too was, should this history be, well, the way I'm hearing it, should this history be remembered and why? Because it's very affirming to hear in these days that people who, and this is going to sound like a trite phrase, people who look like me were doing things that gives encouragement that I can go forward and do things in my own period of time. And growing up a Virginian, born in Roanoke, Virginia, family in Hampton, Virginia, I would see successful Black people all around me. My grandmother, my grandfather, people that they were friends with. But the things that I was hearing in the school books in the 1970s and 80s were in complete opposite. If you open up, there was the wonderful article in the RTD in 2013, I believe it was, that was taking a look at the school books from the 1950s that went on through the 70s. And I was in first grade, and yeah, I'll admit that. Because we were the first class in Roanoke, Virginia, to grow up fully integrated from kindergarten through 12th grade. Okay. I graduated in 1983. And I was getting different versions of what it was to be a Virginian. Different from what was in my house, different from what was being portrayed. There were lots of teachers who did try to tell the full story, but it was a challenge. And to have this accessible is so key. To have you doing the research that you're doing, you doing the research that you're doing, and us getting the stories out is so incredibly important. The stories never died. They were just being told in stovepipes. You know, parallel, silos is one way to look at it. But why not bring it together? Because weren't we all here? Experiencing it together, creating it together? And even if those plaques had come down, it's on the Encyclopedia Virginia. You know?
It's online.
It's online. You're not erasing it by taking it. We put it out there for that moment in time because we have the momentum to get it there, and it is so great to be able to run your fingers over those names, tactile sense of it. But it's not gone. They can't put it back in the box.
You used the phrase, the full history. That's what I've been trying to get at for 50 some odd years studying Virginia history. When I first started studying history, it was all white male history. Too much white male history, nothing about women, nothing about children, almost nothing about First Nations tribes. And what there was about Black people was thin and wrong. I've been extremely pleased to work on this project over the years because it fills an essential gap in our knowledge. You know, most people still think that this period after the Civil War that's called Reconstruction was a failure, that black people proved they didn't have the wherewithal to succeed economically, that they were all illiterate, that they were inept, that the ones who got into politics were corrupt and were used as pliant tools by radical northern reformers who were trying to destroy the decent society of decent southern white people. And none of that's supported by the evidence. But people still believe that because that's what they learned in school. That's what they learned watching television programs about the period. That's what they learned at the cinema. That's part of the popular culture. And it's just flat out wrong. People who argue that we shouldn't be studying black history are showing how ignorant they are of the nature of our history. I mean, for pity's sake, you can't understand white history if you don't understand black history properly. For too long, it's been white people who've written the story. I mean, I happen to be one of a white man, but I don't like what they did. They lied to us. They lied to our children and our grandchildren. They created successive generations of public policymakers who, whether they knew it or not, were working from false premises on behalf of white supremacy. They did that. They didn't know it, but they did it. They absorbed these erroneous values and erroneous views of the past when they were children. And we all know, if you learn something when you're young, it's very hard to unlearn it. It's harder than getting chewing gum off your shoe. You got to start off on the right foot. Well, I mixed up that metaphor, didn't I?
But it works. It works.
But this has
We get you. We get you.
this has been a great deal of fun for me. I learned something every day for the last 10 or 12 years. Just about the time that Viola Baskerville had this idea to put all these biographies in this plaque in the Capitol, the Dictionary of Virginia Biography, my colleagues here at the library, and Matthew Gibson decided that we would do those biographies as a unit. We got a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we went to work on it because this was one of the most important big gaps in the whole history of Virginia. I mean, what's more important than the end of slavery and freed people making their own way in the world? Freed people were not failures. These black politicians were not failures. They were a minority, so they didn't succeed all the time, but that was just a matter of numbers. But the myth that Reconstruction failed still permeates American society. It didn't fail, it was sabotaged by the white supremacists. What we've been too often doing is focusing on national politics in this time, which is another story of white political men. But if you look at what people in Virginia were doing, white and black, they were not reconstructing something, they were trying to construct a new Virginia. Many of them wanted an inclusive Virginia, including some white people. There were some decent white people there who decided after slavery was over that black people were actually human beings and deserved those rights that were guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution and by the Virginia Constitution of 1869, which actually had better language in it than the 14th Amendment. I mean, this is an inspiring story in many ways. Many inspiring stories. Every single biography is inspiring in one way or another.
Thank you. So we talk about the idea that Reconstruction was a failure, and then the fact that it wasn't. Let's talk a little bit about, I mean, I think they've already been alluded to, especially by you, Dr. Lee, about the successes, the legacies that came out of that black political activism from 1869 to really 1895, if not later. Talk a little bit about what's the inheritance of that today in our society, despite the fact that some of that inheritance is still contested.
I, just for fun, went through a list and made a list of accomplishments of those Black legislators. So thanks to those Black legislators, Virginia started to look at eviction notices for tenants. Virginia State University was created. Juror diversity became critical, became important to make sure that if a Black person came before court, then there would be a true juror of his peers. Non-discrimination in travel started to be worked on. Virginia had a state geologist because of a Black man. So the state geologist that gets that salary every year and gets in the budget, and the Department of Mines, Minerals in Virginia exists because of a Black man. There's compulsory school attendance. The first fight for interracial marriage was by Delegate Ched Dungy from Cumberland County, 85 years before Loving versus Virginia. State Office of Superintendent of Public Schools was created. The whole system of public education is mentioned. Before that, poor whites were getting some education if they could. Mainly the upper class received education through parochial schools, private schools. Voting rights started to be worked on. Humane treatment of prisoners. No more public whippings. There used to be public whippings in Virginia, no more of that. Guaranteed equal rights, equal access and civil rights for all people. Protection and preservation of fish and oysters. That's very important for people who make a livelihood out of that industry. Prevention of underage drinking was very important. And so that's just a small summary of the list of items that these very capable men started to attack. And these were individuals with all ranges of expertise. I mean, you had people who worked with their hands, who were bricklayers, but you also had lawyers, you had people who were doctors. There was one individual whose father actually escaped the revolution in Haiti, came to Virginia. This delegate spoke French and English fluently. You had a dentist from Norfolk who was an able debater. I mean, you had illustrious people who knew that they needed to seize the moment and move the state forward. They would have been comparable, some of them would have been comparable to your congressional squad. So they were taking whatever liaisons they had between and among the readjusters that came in or the white Republicans that came in, and they were, no permanent friends and no permanent enemies. They were about the business of moving Virginia forward and particularly helping African Americans.
I really appreciate what you said about the individualism of each of those persons, because oftentimes when we think of some group like African American legislators, you think of them in a monolith. But each of them had their own characteristics, individualities, idiosyncrasies. And one of the things I can appreciate about this for teachers and or lifelong learners is you could take entries from the Encyclopedia of Virginia, Dictionary of Virginia Biography. You can pull those facts out, and then you can start to rebuild a portrait around those facts with context. And this would help students to move past that factoid kind of teaching that they're suffering from with the criteria now, and really began to understand history from a personal perspective. And they could learn something about the localities from which they come from. because you have these legislators coming from all of the localities around the Commonwealth. And it would give them a different picture of Virginia than what they get from the textbooks. So for any teachers that are here or listening, any lifelong learners, grandparents, parents, use the Dictionary of Virginia Biography and the Encyclopedia to begin to put flesh on the bones.
Yeah, that's a great idea because, when you were talking about the backgrounds of the various people who became legislators, I was thinking about James Fields and how he was not only a lawyer, but he was also a farmer at the same time. And his father had been a shoemaker and a wheelwright, and his brother did oystering, and they were getting the education and educating others, but they had so many different things of life skills that they brought with them. So when you are teaching about these individuals, you can really latch on to the fact that you can take whatever background that you have and use it to move forward. It, you don't have to be limited just because you don't have a degree in something. You have a good brain. You have great skills. You have a way of thinking. Use it. And you see the evidence of that in these biographies. So use it, please.
And I'd also say, too, because we are here at the Library of Virginia, this is where you come for those primary sources. You could actually touch the documents. Can you still touch the documents? Everything is,
You can get real close.
everything changes. You never know. And so we're in a prime position to really learn history from a very personal perspective, a very hands-on perspective. And I think that, too, helps students to appreciate history much more fully. And you can see the actual documents.
And you might look at it differently, too. Someone else has been looking at a document with their particular lens, but you come with a different background and you see the same phrase, but it hits you differently, and you can add on that and collaborate.
This is the best place in the world to do this work.
It is.
You couldn't do it anyplace else. We recruited my colleagues, Mary, Julian, and John Deal, and our late excellent friend and colleague, the late Sarah Bars, recruited, I don't know, maybe 36 or more historians to research and write these biographies. They did wonderful work. Each of them was able to spend much more time doing research than the first pioneers were able to do. I think we should acknowledge the people who came first and pointed the way. Black scholars. Alrutheus Taylor, who in the 1920s published The Negro in Reconstruction in Virginia. He focused on the years from 1865 to 1870, very narrow time frame, when black men first got the vote, and 24 of them served in the Constitutional Convention of 1867 and 68, which, among other things, that Constitution required the General Assembly to create the first statewide system of public schools for all children in Virginia. The second scholar that we recognized, Viola Baskerville mentioned him earlier, was Luther Porter Jackson, who taught at Virginia State and who in 1945 published Negro Office Holders in Virginia. His book covers from 1865 to 1895, after the last of these legislators had finished his term. These were remarkable people we discovered. We were able to discover about them because we worked here. Some of the biographers lived a long ways away, but we were able to make them copies of essential documents, unique documents that are here. I don't think we could have done this job as well 20 or 30 years ago, because now we have online, easily searchable family history records, census, cemetery records, birth, marriage, and death records. We have right here in the library the original election returns. That allowed us to find out whether people won elections by large margins or small margins. And we also learned that some of these people we were interested in occasionally lost an election. We didn't know that for sure. It's not surprising, but we know that now. We have deed and will and court order books that allow us to understand about people's property holdings. We actually can look at how much tax they paid and know about their economic success or their ups and downs of their economic lives. Plus, we also now have access to many more newspapers than Al Ruthius Taylor and Luther P. Jackson had. The Library of Congress Chronicling America project, you can search for these people, and you can find them in newspaper stories in D.C. or in New York or in Cleveland, where there were black newspapers that were copying news items from Virginia papers that do not survive. Even better, right here in the library, the Virginia Newspaper Project has been scanning Virginia newspapers and creating its own online newspaper archive called Chronicling Virginia. Goodness knows how much we learned out of that we didn't know before. We find records of meetings of black politicians, black county committee meetings in the Republican Party at the time. We were able to reconstruct a whole range of wonderful human dramas. That's what's interesting about studying these biographies, is every one of these is a human drama. Every person in history is part of his or her own human drama. All this matters to people. You know, the two subjects that come up most often throughout the entire last 35 years of the 19th century are the vote, because the black people were saying before the Civil War was over, we have to have the vote. If we don't have the vote, we can't protect any other rights. And of course, they were correct. The other subject that comes up is education. I mean, 1870, 90% of black Virginians were illiterate. Now, the educational system in this state was so lousy that 40% of white people were illiterate too. That's why one of the critical successes of this period is an obscure group of people called the Readjuster Party, formed in the 1870s to adjust or readjust the old public debt of Virginia, to reduce the amount of interest payments and reduce the amount of principal to be paid, so that the tax money didn't all go to foreign bond speculators. It could go to the schools. And what's really interesting here is that all the black politicians were in favor of that. A great many of the white politicians were too. So here's an opportunity for black politicians and white politicians to unite on something that's of interest to all of their children and grandchildren. They created the public school system. If you read the newspapers of the time, you find debates about public education and funding the public schools, about who can vote and who can not vote, and they're almost interchangeable with what I was reading in the newspaper this morning. It ain't over.
A couple more questions, then I'm going to turn it over to the audience, if that's all right with y'all, to get questions from you all. One, you know, so there's a famous quote, obviously, that Ta-Nehisi Coates used for his great book called "For 8 Years We Were in Power," and actually comes from a black delegate from South Carolina, whose name I forgot because, as a white South Carolina kid, I did never hear anything about Reconstruction history, right? Maybe I would have known his name if actually we had learned it when I was in grade school. But it's this idea that between basically 67 and 1877, there was black legislative power. In Virginia, though, it happens well beyond that compromise of 1877. Maybe even you could say formally until the Constitution of 1901, 1902. Do you have a sense about what about the Virginia environment was different at that time? Maybe that's too much of a fastball question. I don't know.
Well, in part, I think it's this readjuster movement that united black and white politicians at the end of the 1870s. most people think Reconstruction was over by then, but people were constructing or reconstructing or trying to change things all the way through the rest of the century. Virginia did a unique thing in the Old South. It created a biracial political coalition that worked. But it worked only for a short time, because just as soon as they readjusted the debt, the white supremacists in the Democratic Party appealed to all of the white voters who had supported that and said, okay, we'll support the debt settlement, and we will support the schools. And we will drive these black people out of public life forever and end black domination of Virginia, even though there was no black domination to end. In some southern states in the 1890s, the Populist Party formed a series of short-lived alliances between poor white farmers and poor black farmers that did much the same thing. I mean, that coalition took over North Carolina in the 1890s. Virginia had already tried it, but because we had a much larger white population than black population in this state, guess who eventually won?
Yes, it's very telling that James Fields and a couple of other black legislators were the last to be in the Virginia House of Delegates, and that where I work at Maggie Walker, William Ferguson Reed grew up next door. And so my ancestor was one of the last in the House of Delegates, and he was one of the first to after Reconstruction. So that gives you a bookend on how little time there was when you were saying they ran them completely out, but they did come back to prominence, to be here. They could not be run out completely. And the other part I'd like to say, just because it came to my mind, is that when we were talking about Luther Porter Jackson, within the rooms at my grandmother's house, she had that booklet tucked in the drawer there. And it took me a little while to realize that he was her professor. And she had all these pieces of history tucked in the drawers in the house. How many of us have this kind of stuff that you're talking about, how rich it is in the collections at the Library of Virginia, but what do we have in our homes that would help illuminate this history? And I'm not talking about just black people either, because another theme that is starting to come up more recently is that we're now getting these, getting the marginalized voices, as we say, be able to speak. How can we get in conversation? So those who were the Southern Democrats who were trying to push folks out all those years ago, can their descendants get together with the descendants of those who were the legislators and really come together to form that coalition once again? So let us find our history, and let us come together and talk about that history together.
As I was just thinking too, so many of us do research, and you mentioned the whole wonderful list of all the resources that are here at the Library of Virginia, but those delegates that went to that convention in 1867 to 1868, they were sent there by voters. And those voters were also African-American voters. So you can go online and look at the poll books, the colored poll books is what they're called, county by county, and you just might find your ancestor that was also a very pivotal part of this movement, who voted in that first election to send their representative to the convention and who voted thereafter. I found at least 4 of my ancestors who were registered voters and who went and who are on the poll books, and I assume they went and voted.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I looked at James B. Carter, one of the legislators that was from Chesterfield, and I'm from Chesterfield. And so I wanted to learn more about his life, and I did not have time to look at the poll books, but I will. But when you consider what this could do for students who are learning history about their locality, it gives them the opportunity to see connections from a different perspective. And I think that that is really important for all of us, to look beyond our own perspective, to consider what other ways we can see history, see life, see society. And so to be able to go to the Encyclopedia Virginia, the Dictionary of Virginia, Biography, and get this information about the legislators, and then use the resources to flesh it out, opens up a whole new realm of history that cannot be put back in the box, as you say.
Thank you. I can't tell you the irony of going from poll books to poll taxes, but and also the idea that that those poll books were all about vocal voting, right? The idea that you were of community voting. You didn't have that sort of the ballot of basically being anonymous, and that's an interesting thing about that. But thinking about voting, thinking about down ballot voting, the importance of not just district level voting, state level voting, but municipal locality. What have we learned much about that? Because that's also where we have a lot of impact in our local government and municipal governments during this time. Do we know much about that through this process?
I know that Elsa Barkley Brown had done some research on that, and actually voting was dangerous, particularly for Black people. But it was Black women that spurred the Black men on to vote. And there were huge turnouts of voters, which got these legislators into office, really. So we do know that it was extremely dangerous, but they did vote. And we have all of these legislators who were put in those positions by Black people who were willing to take that chance.
It may be that the agenda for future researchers will be local office holding and local politics. We don't have very much good scholarship on that. There's a very fine chapter in a book about 30 years ago on Richmond City Council members, and there's a good deal we know about Petersburg. Luther P. Jackson has a list of local office holders in the back of his book. That's information he came across while he was looking for legislators and constitutional convention members. We don't know how many Black people served as on boards of supervisors or as tax assessors or as commonwealth attorneys, almost anywhere. We know they were there. It's going to be very laborious work in records that are sometimes still in county courthouses or city halls, records that may or may not even tell you whether the name of the office holder is the name of a white man or a Black man. Probably the way to do this is to get some people in graduate school to do research papers on Southampton County or Amelia County or Old Princess Anne County and see what they can learn. If you'll get in there and dig, you'll find a lot more. I remember when we first started this project, first thing we did was we read Luther Porter Jackson. And he had 2 or 3 sentences or a short paragraph on these delegates and senators. We thought, well, maybe we can get 50 words on some of them. But if you spend the time and you dig, you can get full biographies. I think every one of the ones we have is more than 500 words. Some of them are more than 1,000, and they could have been longer still if we waited to complete this for another 10 years.
Right.
But
We can always add.
Local office holding And local
Volume
politics
2.
is a very fruitful source of further insight, and I can't wait to read what somebody else does.
I would also suggest that there probably are federal positions that African Americans were appointed to as well, because of, I guess it's the opportunity, and also the federal government coming in and making sure that there were individuals in the community that looked like the people in the community. Just, it's a safety thing, and also the opportunity that the federal government was hiring individuals.
And I'd say in addition to graduate students, this would be a good project for genealogy groups, African American history and genealogy. And
I got you.
I'm looking right at her too. And those lifelong learners, and I've mentioned lifelong learners a couple of times, because often we think of students, but there are those people who have the discretionary time once you reach a certain age in life that you can devote to genealogy. And they love this kind of thing.
Well, thank you. I want to turn it now. I think we have 30 minutes left. Is that correct? Am I right, or am I completely misguided in my time management? I hope not. Okay. We've got about 30 minutes. I'd love to turn it to the audience for some questions for our panelists. Yes, you, sir.
Yes, I have a copy of Mr. Jackson's book here. And in the book, most of the office holders back then, which was black, they owned a lot of property. Most of them was owned 10, 15 homes and acres of land. Now, back in the day, a lot of courthouses were burned down. I mean, and they didn't catch fire from stoves. They were intentionally burned down behind records. A good one that I've been looking at for years is in Buckingham County. And nobody right to this day can solve that problem. But deeds and records, they just was destroyed. And I was just wondering about Mr. Reeves. He owned a lot of property in the Hopewell area. Did his ancestors get into the properties that he owned? Because he was worth about $25,000 when he died. And $25,000 would buy a lot of houses on Monument Avenue at that particular time.
I'll give you the name of a very popular film right now to answer that question. Nope. But seriously, so no, we didn't get didn't get that property passed down, though we still have family in the Hampton Roads area. And so with the next generation, they were inherited and used that and were able to go to school out in Washington, Washington, D.C. and things like that, and become doctors and lawyers. But as it would happen, you start trying to build the wealth, but it gets snatched away. And each generation, we ended up building it again, and it gets snatched away. But the one thing that they never took away from us, the education, the drive to be educated, to make sure our children were educated. And the second thing that they never took away from us was the drive to be a public servant, to serve the community. All 8 of the kids in my generation are 6 out of the 8 are public servants working for the federal government or the state, and the other 2 are contractors working for the federal government. But it was something that was instilled in us and passed down generation to generation. So no, we don't have that money, but we got the knowledge and the drive.
Buckingham County, if memory serves me correctly, has the distinction of having the only black man who served in the Constitutional Convention of 1967 and 8, and in the House of Delegates, and in the State Senate. Man named Frank Moss. He was dynamite. They told stories about him for generations about how formidable a politician he was.
Uh, let me-
Hi, I'm sorry. I'm Muriel Branch, and I'm from Cumberland County. I'm a descendant of Shed Dungies. What I want us to consider is, how do we pass this information on to younger people? How do we package this information so that our young people feel like it's accessible and relevant to them?
Dictionary of Virginia, Biography, and Encyclopedia of Virginia. It's not like it's like they've got to read for weeks. It's a relatively quick read, and it's written so that a wide variety of people can appreciate it. And it has resources listed as well.
Middle school kids
Yeah.
are, you know, the Dictionary of Virginia, and all of this is wonderful,
Right.
but they like stuff moving.
Yeah.
No, that's
You know, they like little short clips. They are the TikTok generation. So are we even thinking about making it accessible in those kinds of ways? I don't mean dummying it down.
Ms. Muriel, if I can say, and it's a pleasure to see you again. What we can do is have them take the information from the Encyclopedia, the dictionary, and create it. They can be content creators. That is what will make it stick. And then for the way I learned these things is by spending time with my grandmothers and listening to their stories. And then I've been able to take it and create programming. I'm in a position where I can create programming that then informs other people. So when we have our Maggie O. Walker's Leadership Institute, we have the students study and create videos and present them in a public forum. So that's the way to make the bridge. Talk to them, tell them about these stories, and then give opportunities and assignments, if you will, for them to create and publish. So that's the idea, I think.
Matthew will remember that when we started this collaboration, one of our principal audiences was to be school teachers. So the school teachers can serve as a good intermediary to take this material and use it in whatever way they think will work in their classroom to engage the students in these human dramas and allow the students to take ownership of this part of their own shared history.
Yeah, because when you look at some of the stories, I mean, reading the story of James Fields when he was a kid, he was just 17 years old when he ran away from and emancipated himself. And then when he was working with the Freedmen's Bureau for something, he was really a radical as a teenager. So can you imagine a teenager reading this primary documentation about this person who was the same age as they are? And, you know, how fierce that could be, you know?
Yeah.
So it's in there, that human drama.
When we consider the success of Hamilton, for example, you could take any of these biographies and create poetry, songs, musicals, creative nonfiction, creative fiction, dramas. There's a whole range of experiences that they can create just from using these sources.
Ajena, you bring up such a great point about empowering students because they aren't passive consumers. They are creators. right? And if you give them the material, they will create. I remember there's a project that Encyclopedia Virginia was working on in Harrisonburg about Lucy Sims. She was formerly enslaved, became a black educator, and amazing sort of centerpiece of the Harrisonburg educational community. So we had the kids in the Lucy Sims school area where they've got this beautiful mural on the wall about who Lucy Sims was, and they were beginning to do research about her life, and they were creating multimedia pieces around that. They can create. I think that's a great idea. It's empowerment. And talk about seeing yourself in history, seeing yourself creating history. That's amazing, right? I love that. Other question? Yes, sir.
Would you care to share from your information them speaking to the matter of public service or a sense of moral constraint? I'm not a politician, you know, because I can get elected and know how to woo and so forth. But I am really a servant and have a sense of moral constraint. And as a result of that, I think we need that in order to really appreciate when you have a good politician. You know, when you have a good politician, you need to understand something about their moral makeup. And, you know, and they are not bought and sold by goodies and power and position. I am here as a public servant. And I wondered, did you find anything where they kind of talked about that, or maybe they didn't know, but I would be interested.
There was one legislator, and I can't remember his name, that really got turned off because of what he saw going on behind the scenes, and he kind of walked away from it. He didn't go back for re-election. There were over 90-some elected officials in a period of time that was less than 30 years. And some only served a year or a term. Others stayed there for much longer. But when the white, I guess what would have been the white liberal individuals from the North came down and united with the black legislators, and then the white Democrats who had been there saw this collaboration going on that they didn't really like. They didn't like the collaboration with the readjusters. And so there were I guess the squad of 14, I would call them, with Mr. Fields in there, who just had to put out a letter and had explained to the black population that we're going with the readjusters because they have our best interest at heart. There were black citizens who didn't understand the turmoil that was going on. But there was one legislator that he walked away from it because, you know, politics is politics. But there were individuals that were committed there for the good of the people.
One of the white supremacy myths about this period is the black politicians were largely corruptible and easily corruptible, and got used by northern white radicals. That's just not true at all. We didn't find anything like that. We did find black politicians resisting white corrupt officials. Don't tell anybody I said so, but the corrupt people were mostly lawyers and railroad lobbyists and people who owned the public debt. Yeah. They were interested in getting their way, and they failed to be able to bribe these black men because it wasn't in the black men's interest. That's one of many myths that the research we have all been engaged in has finally exploded.
More of the legislators were literate than people had thought, because many of them had learned surreptitiously how to read and write during slavery. Because you remember that was against the law. But they did come in knowing how to read and write, and there were times when white legislators thought that they were ignorant or just didn't know anything because they didn't speak that much. But when they did speak, they had something to say.
It's like E.F. Hutton.
Yes, very much so. Many of them were landowners as well, owned businesses. Some of them were mixed race, had white patrons, but not all. And so they came from this mix of backgrounds, but were much more intelligent than people thought they were.
A couple were from Howard Law School, had graduated from Howard Law School. So they were, it was a very dynamic mix of individuals. And even if the ones that were there did not have a law degree or medical degree or weren't a dentist, they had skills. They understood the community they represented. A lot of them were ministers who held their congregation and their people in their hands, literally on Sundays and when they were in the legislature. So they were very well connected with the communities they represented.
My name is Michelle. I want to pivot back to what this young lady stated. How do we get our children to see that it's relevant, or the young people? Now, I have a granddaughter. She lives in Florida. Dun, 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 dun. Okay. I tried to just speak with her about my history a little bit, but last week was an opening. She says, Mimi, I have to do a project on Sojourner Truth. I said, well, let's look her up. I said, do you realize that she lived in the lifetime of my grandmother's grandmother? And I met my grandmother, she just perked up. And when I said to her, I said, do you realize that when Mimi Collins, in her lifetime, voting was not always accessible? She's like, but I thought that was hundreds of years ago. I said, well, I know you think I'm old, but I'm not that old. So instead of preaching to her, when she has a project or when she has something that she says to me, I can say, I can tell you a little bit about that. And moving forward, for the young people here who want to spread, attend events. We had a historic event yesterday, and a lot of people do not know how important that is. But whenever you can take that event and tie it with another event, they see it. So speaking of TikTok, her report was done via TikTok, and she was able to make it a little bit more exciting, and she wanted to dig deeper. So it begins with all of us. We cannot hold anyone responsible for our family members, young family members, not knowing anything.
That's so true.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Francine Ates Hunter, and this is my cousin Brenda Campbell, and we are the descendants of the Honorable Armstead Stokelaus Nickens. And our question relates to education. We were wondering, within today's current climate, what the flexibility and/or limitations or restrictions that educators have with teaching such a curriculum in their classroom as it relates to the Department of Education, as it relates to schools locally, regionally, statewide. So that's one question. And then the second is, again, what are the flexibilities with allowing this curriculum throughout the year, seasonally, from January 1 until December 31st, instead of just concentrating on it during the month of February, or a snippet of it in the beginning of June for Juneteenth? So that's the question. Thank you, dear.
The teaching of education is in flux around the country, but particularly Florida and the southern states, and of course Virginia is falling in line with that. The historians and those who care about history are really in the fight to make sure that we can teach, that teachers can teach a full history. We're making sure that teachers know of the resources that are available. There was recently, what was that thing? That hearing, I guess you would call it, where anyone could say why we should have a full opportunity to teach history. And of course, the governor wants to now control the localities regarding teaching rather than the localities controlling themselves. So we're in a fight, and it's going to most likely be a protracted fight
And
because
it's nothing we haven't seen before.
that's so
When you study the history, you see the patterns. But go ahead.
Yes, yes. So it calls upon all of us to step up in the ways that we can to really do what we can, because otherwise we will have a generation of ignorant people.
What Dr. Lee means is another generation of ignorant people. I mean, I haven't taught in a public school since 1971, and that was not even in Virginia, so I can't really speak to the Department of Education. But everybody in here, I think, probably is a parent or a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle with an interest in how children learn and what they learn, and that they don't learn false history. Just because the State Department of Education says you have to follow these particular SOLs doesn't mean that you can't smuggle in some real education while you're doing it. I mean, we can talk to school board members in our towns and counties. We can talk to the teachers of our children and say, look, I want my children to know this part of the history, or my grandchildren, if you happen to be a senior person. But this is important stuff. So we have to think broadly about how we approach solving problems that, frankly, that other people create.
And even those without children, such as myself, we care about education. We want our citizenry to be educated. We want businesses to come into our localities and know that they'll have a workforce that's educated. And I'll just say this as a personal aside. I'm planning to run for the school board because it's a necessity. I see it as a necessity. I see it as a moral obligation, really. I'm at that place in my life when I can do what I want. It's a good place to be. So good. So good. And I can't believe I'm doing this, but it's necessary. And I feel compelled to do it. And I don't have children, but I care about all children. And I think all of us who care about freedom would want to make sure that our children can have a decent education. Not just a decent education, a good, excellent education.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to know how much of the information on the readjusters, including the newspapers and the letter you talked about that the 14 written, are digital, or
How do you get it?
my health has not been as good as it used to be, so I can't spend all that time in archives the way I love to do.
A lot of information is online. It's in newspapers. Chronicling America was mentioned, newspapers.com. I mean, sometimes you just put in a keyword and up pops a tremendous amount of resources. Linden libraries. So there are ways that you can have access or get access to the information.
And I'm thinking,
I had a relative at Central State, and I know they've been collecting those records, and I want to know how difficult it is to get to those type of records. I know they're coming under HIPAA and all those type of things, but that was another thing that I was interested in.
Some of the genealogical systems.
Yeah,
Those
there is an
records are being digitized.
they're being digitalized. There is an individual working on making that information accessible. And there is a process they're going through to not only the digitalize, but to preserve those records, because they're in a state of physical decline. I mean, they're not kept where they need to be kept. But there is an individual that is working to preserve those records and hopefully to make that information available. Some of the information on some of those patients, actually, that were at Central State, what was the precursor to Central State, the lunatic asylum, they call it lunatic asylum, that was in Richmond but moved to Petersburg. Some of those early individuals, those patients that were in the 1860s, 1870s, their names are in the Freedmen Bureau records. The Freedmen Bureau records. There were, okay.
But I didn't know where to go after that.
Well, maybe we
And I
can.
know King David.
Yeah, he's working. He's the one that's working on it. So if you know him, that's your best resource. Yeah, he's made that one of his projects. So that's the best person to go to.
And I believe he had an exhibit in Washington,
He did
D.C.
have an
in the
exhibit.
fall.
Mhm. Exactly.
Yeah, and I also want to mention New American History. The University of Richmond is a good resource that helps put our history into context as well.
The young gentleman in the back cajoled me for one more question. So there we
Thank
go.
you. Thank you for calling me young. Yeah, my name is Martin Brown, and I am the descendant of my grandfather's grandfather was RGL Page, and he served in the House of Delegates from 1871 to 1875, and then from 1879 to 1882. And so I just wanted to, first of all, thank the Library of Virginia and thank Virginia Humanities and give you all a round of applause for having this and recognizing our ancestors. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I also just wanted to mention that as we address the issues of today, we have to be informed, and there is an opportunity for us to literally go online, look at the standards of learning. I know that they just came up, but we can read the standards of learning right now. And we can also respond. There's a public comment period. There's a public comment period that's going to take place from March the 15th for the entire week, and there is going to be a public comment opportunity for individuals like us to actually speak to those standards when they come up. And so I think that we can be informed, read the standards, and from what I understand, there's actually more African American history in it this time than in the past, which is really interesting. And I would just encourage us to read the standards and then speak to the standards in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you. Public comment, that's what I was trying to remember. Be prepared to wait, though, once you go down there for that.
Well, I, for one, have been honored to be on the stage with the four of you all this evening, and I hope that the audience here can join me in a round of applause. Because without the work that you all have done, particularly you, Viola, we would not know this content right now. We would not have this information, this history at our fingertips, literally. So thank you all, and I wish you all a wonderful evening. And also, there's one other thing I will just add. The fact that this information is online means that it can be added to. So that as you find new information, whether that's in your attic or your basement or your hidden drawer or the archives here at the Library of Virginia, connect with us and we'll add more to it. So I appreciate it. Thank you so much.